The bright afternoon sunlight filtered through the massive stained-glass windows of the Grand Hall at Buckingham Palace, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished marble floor. It was May 2026, a date that on the surface was meant to mark a quiet and private celebration for Princess Charlotte's 11th birthday. The room was filled with immediate family members, high-ranking royal courtiers and senior officials, all dressed in formal attire, exchanging polite whispers and carrying an air of routine royal duty. However, beneath the calm facade, a strange heaviness hung in the air. Everyone present could feel that this gathering was different from the usual family milestones. The tension grew palpable the moment Princess Anne stepped onto the elevated dais, her familiar, resolute demeanor instantly commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Princess Anne wore a tailored dark suit, her hair immaculately tied back in her signature high bun. Her gaze was incredibly sharp, moving slowly across the room like a blade cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. In her hands, she held a weathered, deep red velvet box that bore the faint golden crest of the royal archives. Standing quietly beside her was young Princess Charlotte, looking exceptionally graceful in a pristine white dress. The little girl's golden blonde hair caught the sunlight, and as she stood there, her delicate features and gentle stance reminded everyone in the room of someone they had all tried very hard to forget, her grandmother, Princess Diana. The entire hall fell into an absolute, breathless silence. The rustle of fabrics and the clinking of glasses vanished in an instant as Anne adjusted the microphone and began to speak, her voice clear, powerful, and echoing with undeniable authority. Today, before the entire royal house and the members of this family, I stand here to declare a decision of utmost importance, and announced, her voice steady and unyielding. I am officially bestowing upon Princess Charlotte the Diana honorific title. She is not merely a young member of the House of Windsor. She is from this moment forward the true inheritor of a profound spirit, the spirit of compassion, unmatched courage, and genuine closeness to the people that her grandmother once championed so fiercely. With a deliberate and slow movement, Anne lifted the lid of the red box, revealing a small, breathtakingly sparkling tiara that gleamed brilliantly under the brilliant palace spotlights. It was a priceless piece of history, an exquisite item closely tied to Diana's most meaningful charity tours, her warm, iconic smile, and the silent, heavy pain she had endured away from the public eye. This tiara, Anne continued, looking directly at the young girl, will belong to Charlotte as an eternal reminder that Princess Diana's legacy is not a relic of the past, but a living truth that resides deep within us. For a few seconds, the room remained completely frozen, shocked by the sheer weight of what had just been spoken. Then, scattered, hesitant applause began to break out, instantly mixed with astonished whispers that spread like wildfire throughout the hall. Kate Middleton gripped Prince William's hand tightly, her knuckles turning white as she tried her best to maintain a composed, diplomatic smile, though her eyes betrayed a look of profound surprise and immediate concern. King Charles sat silently in the center of the room, his face an unreadable mask of complex emotions, a chaotic mix of deep sentimentality and rising anxiety about the political fallout of this unexpected declaration. But the most explosive and completely uncontrolled reaction came from Queen Camilla. Without a warning, Camilla shot up from her velvet seat, the heavy wooden chair creaking loudly against the floor. Her face was heavily flushed, not with emotional warmth, but with a sudden, uncontrollable surge of pure rage. Her voice, shrill and sharp, cut through the solemn atmosphere like a weapon. "This is completely unacceptable," and Camilla barked, her hands trembling as she pointed a finger directly toward the dais. "You have absolutely no right to make such a monumental decision on your own. I demand that this absurd ceremony be cancelled immediately. That tiara does not belong to this generation, and it certainly should not be handed out without proper consultation." The entire grand hall seemed to turn into ice. Camilla had completely lost her usual calculated control in front of hundreds of royal staff and family members. Her voice rose even higher, echoing with a desperate fury. "Diana is gone. We have spent decades looking toward the future of this monarchy. We do not need to constantly dig up and revive a painful, complicated past just to satisfy personal sentiments. Despite the fierce outburst, Princess Anne stood perfectly motionless on the stage, completely unfazed by the Queen's public rage. She did not flinch, nor did she lower her gaze. Instead, she looked back at Camilla with cold, piercing, and entirely resolute eyes. A faint, almost imperceptible smile played at the corner of Anne's mouth, a smile of a strategist who had anticipated this exact explosion and had been waiting for this very reaction for a very long time. Prince William, standing just a few feet away, felt his heart pounding heavily against his chest. He immediately realized that this was never just a simple birthday honor or a routine family gift. His aunt Anne was executing a much larger, incredibly dangerous maneuver. She was not only passing a historic heirloom to his daughter, but she was also sending an undeniable, public message to the entire royal establishment. Princess Diana's legacy could never be erased, no matter how hard someone tried to bury it in the dark corners of history. Young Charlotte, sensing the overwhelming hostility in the room, clutched Princess Anne's hand with her small fingers. Her large, round eyes showed a profound mix of confusion and childhood pride. The little girl leaned in and whispered softly, "Aunt, and did I do something wrong? Why is she so angry?" And knelt down slightly, her rigid posture softening as she looked at her granddaughter. Her voice, though gentle, carried a fierce, unshakable firmness. "No, my dear. You're doing everything perfectly right. Your grandmother would be incredibly proud of you at this exact moment, and so am I." The atmosphere inside the hall was now pulled as taut as a bowstring, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. King Charles gripped the gilded armrests of his throne so tightly that his fingers lost all color, caught between his duty as a monarch and his loyalty to his wife. Camilla stood there, breathing heavily, her furious exterior slowly giving way to a deep-seated, visible fear in her eyes. What was meant to be a private family celebration had officially ignited a high-stakes, behind-the-scenes confrontation over royal legacy, memory, and the invisible lines of power within the modern British royal family. Outside the ancient palace walls, the press was already beginning to catch wind of the tension, preparing to flood the global news cycle with sensational headlines. The war for the true heart of Windsor had officially begun, and Princess Anne had just fired the first, unforgettable shot. Following the explosive and deeply unsettling confrontation in the Grand Hall, the superficial glamour of Buckingham Palace dissolved into a heavy, suffocating quiet. Princess Anne walked with calculated composure back to her private quarters, her back straight and her face an unreadable mask of determination. The dim, warm lighting of her personal sitting room did little to soften the severe expression she had carried since she stepped off the dais. She removed her dark, structured jacket, draped it meticulously over the back of an antique chair, and sat down at her heavy oak desk, letting out a long, slow breath that she had held for hours. Her trusted personal assistant, a woman who had served her with absolute discretion for over 3 decades, entered the room without a sound, placing a cup of hot chamomile tea on the desk, and did not reach for the tea immediately. Instead, she stared blankly at the polished wood surface as the echoes of Camilla's shrill public outburst continued to ring in her ears. The wheel has finally turned, and spoke in a low, gravelly whisper, her voice bearing the weight of a secret she had protected for months. "I have waited for this specific eruption for a very long time, and now there is absolutely no turning back." The decision to ambush the Queen in front of the entire royal household by presenting Diana's tiara to Charlotte was never a sudden impulse. It was the culmination of a half-year of meticulously planned, dangerous espionage within her own family's walls. For the past 6 months, Anne had quietly used her immense respect and position within the palace infrastructure to dig into areas that everyone else had agreed to leave buried. She had reached out to retired courtiers, combed through centuries-old storage ledgers, and cross-referenced historical transfer logs, all with a single, burning purpose: to uncover why the physical memory of Princess Diana was being systematically erased from existence. I did not initiate this out of petty personal malice or sibling rivalry, and continued, her distant gaze fixing on the dark windows overlooking the palace gardens. I initiated this for the sake of historic justice, because Diana has been deliberately turned into a ghost within her own children's home. She began to review the unsettling timeline she had assembled during her silent, solitary investigation. Over the past 20 years, an alarming number of original documents, handwritten letters, and deeply personal mementos belonging to the late Princess of Wales had vanished without a single trace from the official royal archives. Letters that Diana had frantically written to her young sons, William and Harry, detailing her fears and her hopes for their future, diaries kept during her loneliest months, and even specific pieces of jewelry worn during her historic charity tours to landmine zones and AIDS wards had all evaporated from the secure vaults, and had personally verified the archive logs from 1998, 2005, and 2012, discovering that while these items were formally registered in the past, their physical locations were now completely blank, with no authorized transfer sheets or explanatory footnotes left behind. The silent conspiracy had truly begun to unravel a few months prior, during a heavily cloaked meeting that completely altered her perspective on the monarchy's internal politics. On a miserable, drizzly afternoon on the quiet outskirts of London, and had driven herself alone to a modest, nondescript brick cottage, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and an oversized dark coat to evade any lingering paparazzi or security details. Waiting for her inside that cold, dimly lit house was a man in his late 70s, his hair stark white and his spine slightly hunched from a lifetime of rigid service. His name was Robert Harrington, a former personal butler who had stood faithfully by Princess Diana's side for more than a decade before her tragic death. When and sat across from him at his small kitchen table, the elderly man's hands trembled violently as he poured 2 cups of tea, his eyes darting toward the curtained windows with a profound, deeply ingrained paranoia. "Your Royal Highness, I wrestled with my conscience for months before I found the courage to respond to your discreet inquiry," Robert had whispered, his voice cracking with an old, suppressed fear. "What I am about to disclose to you is a direct violation of the non-disclosure agreements I was forced to sign, and it could easily destroy what remains of my quiet life, but I cannot take this dark truth to my grave." And had reached across the table, gently placing her hand over his trembling fingers to offer a rare moment of comfort, her voice completely steady. "Robert, look at me. You have my absolute protection. Tell me every single thing you saw, and do not leave out a single detail." Robert took a ragged breath and confessed that immediately following Diana's high-profile divorce from Prince Charles in 1996, a quiet but highly systematic purge of her personal life had been ordered from the highest levels of the palace command structure. According to Robert, vans had arrived at Kensington Palace in the dead of night, loaded with empty crates meant to swallow Diana's personal history whole. "It wasn't a singular event, Your Royal Highness," Robert had explained, his eyes filled with decades-old sorrow. "It was a calculated, multi-stage operation. At first, the senior secretaries claimed it was a standard procedure to protect the family's privacy during the legal separation. Later, after the tragedy in Paris in 1997, the narrative shifted and they claimed the items were being centralized for a permanent historical archive. But I watched them sort through her things. They didn't want to preserve her memory. They wanted to filter it. Anything that showed her true influence, her raw connection to the public, or her private suffering was separated and taken away, never to be seen again." Even more chilling was Robert's description of the human cost of this institutional erasure. Any palace staff member, maid, chauffeur, or guard who had shown fierce loyalty to Diana or who possessed intimate knowledge of the unfair treatment she endured was systematically neutralized. "They didn't fire us outright, because that would have raised immediate red flags with the press," Robert revealed, lowering his voice to a near impenetrable whisper. "Instead, they used subtle, psychological warfare. We were reassigned to remote royal estates in Scotland or Wales, passed over for well-deserved promotions, or quietly coerced into signing early retirement packages under incredibly vague pretexts. Some of my colleagues who threatened to speak to biographers received anonymous, Terrifying phone calls in the middle of the night, reminding them that their pensions and their family's safety depended entirely on their permanent silence. I stayed quiet for 20 years because I was terrified, but watching her legacy bleed away day by day has been an unbearable torture. And had listened to the old butler's testimony without a single interruption, her face hardening into an expression of pure iron as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place with terrifying precision. Though Robert lacked the physical documentation to prove who had authorized the midnight purges, his narrative perfectly explained the anomalous gaps and had discovered in the archive vaults. Most importantly, it pointed directly to a singular motive that only one person in the entire kingdom possessed: a desperate, lifelong need to completely overwrite Diana's shadow so that a new queen could ascend the throne without being constantly haunted by the ghost of the people's princess. Camilla was the only individual who benefited from Diana being remembered as merely a tragic, unstable chapter in royal history, rather than the global icon of compassion she truly was. As Prince William suddenly appeared at the doorway of her sitting room later that evening, still dressed in his formal suit from the disastrous birthday gathering, and closed her notebook and looked at her nephew with profound empathy. William's face was pale, his eyes heavily bloodshot from the immense stress of witnessing his stepmother and his aunt tear the family piece apart in public. "Aunt, and I just left Father's study, and the entire West Wing is in absolute chaos," William said, closing the door tightly behind him as he stepped into the room. "The courtiers are frantic, and Father is deeply wounded. Do you honestly believe that causing this level of public fractures within the family is justified right now?" And stood up from her desk, her sharp eyes softening only slightly as she walked over to stand directly in front of Diana's eldest son. "William, look at me," and said, her voice dropping into a register of fierce, maternal protection. "You are Diana's son. You, more than anyone alive, carry the physical and emotional scars of what your mother was forced to endure within this institution. If we do not stand up and aggressively protect her physical legacy right now, while we still have the power to do so, then Charlotte, George, and Louis will grow up in a palace that has completely sanitized their grandmother's existence. They will only know her through edited, approved historical textbooks. I will not allow this family to commit the sin of rewriting history just to keep the peace. The truth must come to light, no matter how heavy the price." William remained completely silent for a long moment, staring down at his hands, caught between his duty to the stability of his father's reign and the profound love he still held for his mother's stolen memory. He did not utter a single word of protest. Instead, he gave his aunt a slow, solemn nod of understanding before quietly exiting back into the shadows of the corridor, leaving and alone to prepare for the next phase of the inevitable war. As the internal shockwaves from Princess Anne's defiance continued to ripple through the historic corridors of Buckingham Palace, the quiet psychological warfare reached its absolute breaking point. Camilla had not remained idle. Driven by a growing undercurrent of panic, she had already initiated a frantic, late-night purge of the remaining electronic logs within the royal network, while instructing her closest allies to quietly intimidate anyone who might cooperate with Anne's quiet inquiries. But Princess Anne was several steps ahead, fully understanding that verbal testimonies from aging retainers like Robert Harrington, while emotionally devastating, would never be enough to dismantle a system of denial that had been fortified for over 20 years. She needed bulletproof, undeniable physical evidence that could withstand the scrutiny of King Charles and the most powerful legal minds of the realm. That defining breakthrough arrived on a stormy, torrential evening in late May 2026, inside a modest, rain-lashed house in the quiet suburbs of Surrey. Anne had traveled there under the cover of darkness to meet Mr. Edward Langford, a 70-year-old former senior archive assistant who had retired under immense corporate pressure in 2008. Langford's eyes were filled with a profound mixture of exhaustion and sudden relief as he guided the Princess Royal into his cramped, secure basement office. "Your Royal Highness, I have spent nearly 2 decades looking over my shoulder, waiting for someone with the courage to look for what was taken," the old man whispered, his hands steady as he unlocked a heavy, fireproof floor safe. From the depths of the safe, he pulled a thick, moisture-sealed binder crammed with photocopied archival minutes, deleted manifestos, and internal cross-transfer slips that explicitly detailed the unauthorized removal of Princess Diana's property. But the crown jewel of his hidden cache was a small, dusty black USB drive. In the winter of 2005, right after the royal wedding, I witnessed the destruction of Diana's letters firsthand. Edward confessed, his voice dropping. I secretly kept a pocket recorder running during an unannounced executive meeting in the secure vault. I knew it was treasonous, but my conscience left me no choice. With her heart pounding, and plugged the drive into her secure laptop, and the cold basement air seemed to freeze completely as an unmistakable, high-pitched female voice filled the small room. Dispose of everything immediately, the recorded voice commanded, cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of empathy. Every single personal letter, every unreleased charity photo, and every sentimental memento related to Diana must be completely extracted from the public catalog. Leave absolutely nothing behind that could remind the public of her during this transition. This is a direct directive from my office. I do not want to see these items resurfacing ever again. It was the indisputable voice of Camilla, captured vividly in 2005, exposing a deliberate, calculated plot to erase the people's princess from the fabric of the institution. Tears of raw anger and absolute vindication welled in Anne's eyes as she clutched the edge of the table. After months of fighting in the dark, she finally possessed the weapon required to deliver true justice. 3 weeks after the initial birthday ceremony, the inevitable day of reckoning arrived when King Charles convened a highly restrictive, emergency family tribunal in a private conference room in the palace's deepest wing, away from the ears of any staff. The atmosphere was thick with a suffocating, unbearable tension as Charles, William, and Camilla sat around a polished mahogany table. Camilla attempted to take the offensive immediately, slamming her manicured hand onto the wood, her voice shrill as she accused and of actively sabotaging the stability of the modern monarchy for personal vanity, and remained completely unmoved, waiting for Camilla to exhaust her theatrical outrage before slowly opening her leather folder and placing the photocopied archive records directly in front of her brother. Then, without uttering a single word, Anne pressed play on her laptop, letting Camilla's cold, historical directive echo through the deathly silent room. The transformation in the room was instantaneous. Camilla's face turned an ash white, deathly pale color as her own voice from 2 decades prior stripped away her carefully constructed defense. Charles listened in absolute, paralyzed silence, his head sinking into his hands as the profound weight of his wife's decades-long deception became undeniably clear, and cold-bloodedly laid out the supporting evidence piece by piece, the matching transfer logs, the signatures of corrupted officials, and the written testimonies of the staff members who had been threatened into permanent exile. This was never an administrative reorganization, Charles, and stated, her powerful voice cutting through the room like iron. This was a systematic, malicious attempt to rewrite history and erase the mother of the future king. The blame shifting ends today. Camilla tried frantically to stammer an excuse, claiming the recording was a massive misunderstanding taken out of context, but the sheer volume of detailed corroborating evidence left her with absolutely no room to hide. Charles finally looked up, his eyes weary, broken, and filled with deep disappointment as he whispered, "Camilla, you have gone too far. I cannot defend this." The resolution of the silent war was delivered swiftly behind closed doors to avoid an international public scandal that could jeopardize the crown. Internally, however, the punishment was absolute. Queen Camilla was stripped of her operational influence, thoroughly isolated from the core family decisions, and quietly ordered to relocate her primary residence to the remote eastern wing of the palace, effectively barred from participating in any major public or royal engagements for the foreseeable future. Late that night, Princess Anne stood by the tall windows of her study, watching the quiet darkness swallow the palace courtyard. Prince William walked in quietly, his face exhausted but his spirit visibly lighter. The cost was incredibly high, and he murmured, standing beside her, and looked out at the horizon, a sad but deeply peaceful smile touching her face. Sometimes, William, to truly heal a house, you must be willing to expose the rot in the foundation. Diana's memory is safe now, and through Charlotte, her light will never be extinguished again. The great storm had finally passed, and the modern generation of Windsor had firmly chosen truth over a comfortable lie.